Thompson. We'll start with a brief outline of the history of the eastern shore of Virginia and Maryland, then take a look at an overview of its many record types. Following that, we'll look at little-known records of importance to family historians who are researching Eastern Shore, Virginia, and Maryland families. These records, the oldest continuous records in British-speaking America, offer much to genealogists, as it was from the Eastern Shore that many waves of migrations west took place, eventually reaching the western coast of America. We'll also look at significant secondary sources and the types of transcriptions of records available. Many researchers will discover that they have Eastern Shore antecedents. Question and answer period will follow the visual online discussion of Delmarva's myriad records. Dr. Thompson retired from Salisbury University in Maryland in 2016 as a distinguished professor of history, where he served for 44 years, including as chairman of the history department for 12 years. He co-founded the Edward H. Knabb Research Center for Delmarva History and Culture at Salisbury University in 1982, and he served as its co-director for over 20 years. The Knabb Center is a hands-on laboratory in which history students are taught how to read, interpret, and write narrations based on original documents. It also houses a collection of Delmarva primary and secondary source materials, valuable for genealogical research. Ray's work outside of academia has included serving on many councils and boards. To name just a few, he has been past president of the Lower Delmarva Genealogical Society, president for 17 years of the Wicomico County chapter of the Maryland Historical Trust, and a member of the Governor's Advisory Board for National Historic Publication and Records. In his retirement, Ray has continued to actively contribute to the historical and genealogical communities and has been awarded the highest service award from Preservation Maryland and the Life Service Award from the Lower Eastern Shore Heritage Council. Ray frequently conducts workshops and classes, works with libraries and historical organizations, and makes presentations for local, regional, and state organizations on the 400-plus years history of the Delmarva and its people. We welcome Ray.
Thank you all for coming, and you won't be seeing me much on the screen because Paula will be putting the images up so they cover the screen, because I have a lot of images for you to look at during the PowerPoint. And Donna and I have a couple of housekeeping things that we need to take care of at the beginning. Donna and I have provided you with a number of resources why that's not. That you might want to use while you're working on your immigrant ancestor. All those materials that Donna sent you in the email are ones for your use in tracking your ancestors and for seeing just how numerous these records are that exist for the Eastern Shore of Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware. Because of the time element, we're going to only be looking at a few of these records tonight, but don't forget that all the other records in the packet that Donna sent you are very valuable for your research. So I'd like to start out by telling you that the PowerPoint is scripted so that it should be approximately 55 minutes in length, and I think that there may be questions that you all have as we're moving through this discussion. If you'll hold them till the end, I believe we should have time to respond to all the questions. So if you'll just jot down your questions as they emerge, we'll hopefully have time to discuss them at the end of the presentation. And now what I need to do is make sure this will,
for you, for Paula, to just tell people they can put their questions in the chat box as well.
Yes, right.
Yeah, I just type that in the chat box.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, now the PowerPoint that's open is on your computer and your microphone is on Claudia's computer. So someone needs to go to to your computer to advance the slides, I think.
Oh, okay. All right. Let me, so I don't understand this. It's not on this computer?
Well, you shared it from your computer when we thought you were going to dial in.
Yeah, right. Okay, now, so I'm thinking that this is an impossibility. Okay.
Just scoot over to your computer and work the program like you.
Are the computers in the, well, then we won't be able to hear him because the microphone is on Claudia's computer.
Yeah, the microphone is in the other. We're in two different rooms, but let me see if I can move this computer to the other room quickly, and then we'll be set.
Okay.
There you go. Okay, thanks.
The speaker is having difficulty with his computer.
After all, oh. I think I've got everybody muted except for Claudia and Donna.
Okay, thanks, Paula. I think we're going to finally get through this.
We're almost there. Thank you again, everyone, for your patience.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right, so
we are in business. We can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, except. All right. Now we are in business. So I'll take a deep breath. These are the handouts that Donna has sent you all. You probably have, hopefully have had a chance to look at them. So you'll know that there is this vast quantity of information that is available for your use in doing research, particularly if you're on the Eastern Shore. But many of these kinds of records are the kinds of records that you can find in other county courthouses as well. So my plan this evening is to provide you with two things. First, a brief history of the Eastern Shore, and secondly, talk about some of the resources to rebuild your own ancestor using some of the oldest records in British-speaking America. We'll be looking at a very special stretch of land, the Eastern Shore. Both of these maps that you're looking at on the screen, and I hope you do have a screen that you can see it on now.
Yes.
It is important that we understand that until recently, this area was a very homogeneous area. The people who lived here in 1950 were mostly descendants of the people who originally settled the area no later than the 1650s. You may be aware that the Eastern Shore of Virginia has the oldest continuous historical records in British-speaking America. The records start in 1632 and are unbroken by fire, by warfare, or by natural catastrophe. These records, especially the 17th century ones, are filled with lifelike and very interesting stories of people who actually lived right here. These stories could be woven into a great tapestry which would rival anything produced on the silver screen. Your story could be as much a page turner as Diana Gabaldon's Outlander series. The Eastern Shore records listed in the handouts you've been given provide a kaleidoscopic view of life in the earliest period of America's development. So try to put yourself back into the 17th century now, and we'll begin the presentation. We'll start with looking at a series of maps of Delmarva. Maps of the Eastern Shore are very crucial to indicating where your ancestor was at any given time because of the changing boundaries of Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware. So all those are very important to understand where your early settler was at any given time. There are many kinds of maps that we will come to see. The earliest British maps of the Chesapeake area are ones crafted by John White between 1585 and 1590. These maps depicted an almost complete absence of the peninsula, which we recognize today as Delmarva. Remember, early maps were oriented east-west, not north-south as we do today. However, I'll, from this time on, orient all maps north-south so you can more easily see the recognizable land masses. In this case, what you're looking at is primarily the barrier islands of North Carolina with just a tiny bit of Virginia. That yellowy orange area at the top is what was called Virginia. This 1585 map depicts the Chesapeake Bay only as an inlet stretching directly westward into the landmass of North America. The land on the upper side of this map would be the Chesapeake Bay in that case. The next map to show the eastern shore was that of John Smith, the English navigator who explored the Chesapeake and created his own rather fanciful map of Virginia in 1612. This map showed extensive forests and numerous Indian tribes on both sides of the bay, giving an accurate impression of an untamed frontier land. At the same time, he depicted an undefined eastern coast of Delmarva, as if it were just sliding off into the ocean. The reason for this is that Smith explored and charted only the Chesapeake and the western shore of the eastern shore, not the ocean coast of the eastern shore. So he didn't do the Atlantic coast. That was done rather by Henry Hudson in 1609 as he charted the ocean coast of Delmarva for Holland, and in 1610 by Samuel Argall, who became the first Englishman to chart that coastal area. By 1618, a revised John Smith map had been published with an east coast, as you can see here, although it did err in depicting a huge chain of mountains stretching across Delmarva. This modern map shows the immense extent of the colony of Virginia in 1609 at the time of the first permanent Virginia settlement. It also shows our area of Delmarva. By the mid-17th century, distorted, unrealistic maps were still being drawn, which were not helpful for navigators, as we see in the case of John Farrar's 1651 map called the Sea of China and the Indies. You may not even be able to see Delmarva on there. This map does, however, identify the eastern shore as the eastern shore or Accomack, and it says Colonel Littleton's plantation and Squire Yardley's plantation. So that is the identification. As long as Virginia was the only colony in the area, there seemed to be no problem. But that changed in 1634 when King Charles I of England granted a charter to Cecil Calvert, Lord Baltimore, for an area called Maryland, north of Virginia. This created a need for more accurate maps.
And I'm hoping that if I at least log into it,
ownership reasons, because Virginia traders and trappers were already heading up into Maryland's eastern shore.
Then you got to be a member to access the recording.
In 1635, King Charles I of England requested a new map of the Chesapeake so that he could establish correct boundaries for both Maryland and Virginia. However, this map was to create numerous boundary issues for both the Maryland and Virginia boundary, which we see here, and also for the northern boundary, which in 1682 would become the area of Pennsylvania. These boundary issues were not completely solved until 1910, when the Supreme Court fixed the boundaries of Maryland finally, an unusual time. Although Lord Baltimore's 1635 map identified the boundaries of Maryland, there were still competing claims about ownership of the eastern shore from both the Dutch and the Swedes, who had earlier occupied the area of Delaware. However, the greatest controversies were between Maryland and Virginia. By 1670, Maryland had 15,000 inhabitants and Virginia had 40,000 residents. A new, more accurate map was necessary to define boundaries. This map, created by Augustine Herman in 1670, was to be the first map to correctly identify the features of the lower eastern shore. And it clearly showed a boundary line of trees separating Virginia from Maryland, with Maryland eventually gaining about 25,000 acres of land from the eastern shore of Virginia. However, Maryland's boundary problems were far from over, as in 1681, King Charles II gave an immense land grant to William Penn. Penn, whose province had no outlet to the ocean, demanded that he be given an outlet to the ocean so that his new province would not be landlocked. Charles then agreed to split the upper shore, eastern shore, between Maryland and Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, he based his split on the only map he had at hand, which was Francis Lamb's map of Maryland of 1676, which had misplaced Cape Henlopen by 25 miles. If the real location of Cape Henlopen had been used, at least 1/3 of Lower Sussex County would have been in Maryland. It was from this initial confusion that for years there was much uncertainty as to where Delaware's lower boundary really was. Maryland claimed land all the way up to Dover as being in Worcester County and Somerset County. This map, drawn by Mike Hitch and John Lyon in the late 1990s, shows Maryland extending far up into Delaware. You can see that whole area below, above those two red lines. In 1751, the trans-peninsular line between Maryland and Delaware was surveyed by local surveyors, clearly indicating the southern boundary of Delaware and the northern boundary of Worcester and Somerset counties in Maryland. Then, in 1767, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon created the famous Mason-Dixon map, which you see here, showing the western boundary of Delaware and the northern boundary of Maryland, that is on the western shore. Finally, in 1795, Samuel Lewis created a map of the states of Maryland and Delaware. This became the standard map used for decades. Many of you who have Delaware ancestors will need to look in the Worcester or Somerset County records for your ancestors, as many of those ancestors thought they were in Maryland rather than in Delaware. Now that we've seen how important maps are for the genealogist, we'll move on to the actual peopling of the Chesapeake. Who were these people who populated the eastern shore? The early Chesapeake was a polyglot area made up of people from many different countries. There were English, and here are some of the English people who actually settled in the first decades on the eastern shore. There were Welsh. There were Irish, Scottish, Swedes, Dutch, lots of Dutch. You may not have known there were that many Dutch people on the lower eastern shore. Germans, and even French. All these people were living side by side and trading with each other in the Chesapeake during the mid-17th century. However, more than 3/4 of those original settlers in the Chesapeake were the English and Lowland Scots, the two largest groups of 17th century immigrants to America. Various types of records help us understand who these 17th century immigrants were. There is a great difference between the first shipload of immigrants to Virginia from later immigrants. It was the promise of wealth which brought the first Englishmen to Virginia. All the early attempts to colonize America were private business ventures, organized by merchants of joint stock companies aimed at gaining riches by populating Virginia. In April of 1607, a group of 104 Englishmen arrived in Virginia, settling at Jamestown. Not one of those who boarded the ships to America had brought a wife. They had all gone only to obtain fortune, planning to return to England to live the good life. Most were not used to hard labor, but were forced to work, or they would starve. In 1609, while the original settlers were starving or dying of malaria, 600 new settlers arrived, looking for the promised land of milk and honey. These new settlers were different from that first group of immigrants who were hunting for gold. Ships' passenger lists provide information about who this second wave of immigrants were. And there really is a lot of information in just this little bit of pagination that you'll see. The passenger lists provide not only the name of the immigrant, the age of the person, they also show the location of the place of embarkation where the person was setting sail from, and the destination, in this case bound for Virginia, and the fact that the voyager took the oath of allegiance to Protestantism. That list also told occupations. You can see clothier, servant, linen draper, baker, of passengers. It also told the relationships of various individuals to each other. Uxor means wife, and you can see wife, child, servant, and so on. Finally, the record also tells the date of the embarkation, the date that the ship was beginning to sail from England. And it also gives the name of the ship on which the immigrants were sailing. So you can see just from this one sheet of paper, there's a lot of information that one can pull out of it about an ancestor. More is known about the immigrants after 1619 due to the discovery of well-written records of John Farrar, deputy to the treasurer of Virginia in 1619. In the Farrar archives are lists of 250 of the 3,000 individuals who were shipped to Virginia in the years 1619 to 1622. The men who sailed in 1619, there were 89 men and 3 boys, were, according to those records, in as good health when they landed as when they set foot on the ship 2.5 months earlier. Much of this Farrar collection is now housed at Magdalen College at Cambridge University, enabling us to understand much about early Virginia, which was previously unclear. The list tells the names, the ages of each man, the county of origin, and the occupation of the individual. Among them were only 7 from London, while 78 had emigrated from the 27 English counties, and 4 had come from Wales. The majority had come from the north and west of England. To make this description completely local, we'll look briefly at the counties of origin in England from which each of these early settlers came. They came from Yorkshire. You can see how many of them came from Yorkshire. I'm going to leave this on for a second while I get the battery fixed on my other computer. So you can see that there is considerable numbers of people who actually were coming from Yorkshire, a very popular area of settlement. Okay. All right, I think we're set now again. So from Yorkshire was not the only county. From Cumbria came others, from Cheshire, from Shropshire, from Gloucestershire, from Somersetshire, from Northamptonshire, only one from Northampton, from Dorset, from Hampshire, from Norfolk, from London, and from Middlesex counties. Yorkshire in the north sent by far the most immigrants. The men ranged from 13 to 57 years of age. The average age was about 24 years of age. Occupationally, they represent a variety of professions, and this is very important. 19 were farmers, 1 was a gardener, 2 were laborers, 3 were sailors, and a waterman. In addition, there were 3 carpenters, a blacksmith, a sawyer, and a bricklayer, a miller, a brewer, a vintner, 3 cooks, 2 bakers, and a butcher were also represented. There were 3 grocers, 2 chandlers. A chandler is a person who sells candles or soap. And there was a merchant tailor, 3 weavers, 3 cloth workers, a felt maker, a skinner, a tanner, a leather dresser, a shoemaker, a silkman, a feather maker, 2 glovers, an embroiderer, kind of surprising, and a tailor. 2 goldsmiths were also on board. Finally, there was a parson's man, a yeoman, and an esquire, and 7 gentlemen. Remember that first group of passengers in 1607 had been almost all gentlemen. This passenger list reveals that the company was, by 1619, avoiding the earlier mistake of including too many gentlemen, and was sending over those who actually had skills, which would immediately benefit the colony. Of the 92 individuals on board, 14 were accompanied by relatives. But I think it's very important to see how carefully they had chosen who was actually going to be on this ship so that they would have people who could do all the things necessary in this new untamed continent. In 1621, a ship laden with women sailed to Virginia. Aged between 15 and 28, these women were daughters of artisans and gentry and had been born in half of the counties of England, mostly in the South, but 2/3 of them lived in or about London at the time of their departure. The average age was about 20 and a half. They were all socially respectable and had domestic skills. They traveled with their family's blessing. The social status of more than 50% of these women is known, 8 having links with the English gentry. 3 were widows, 2 had lost both parents, 11 had lost their fathers. Of only 5 women is it certain that both of their parents were still alive at the time of their immigration. So more than 50% of these women were orphaned, we know. The care taken to record these immigrants extended to recording even the clothing which had been provided them. Each woman was given a petticoat and a waistcoat, a pair of stockings, a pair of garters, 2 smocks, a pair of gloves, a hat and bands. A band was used to keep the shape of the felt hat, an extra round band, an apron, 2 pair of shoes, a towel, 2 coifs. A coif is that close fitting cap that you see in the image there, and 1 crosscloth. Crosscloth is that black sort of bandana that's going around that child's head, as well as worsted and yarn for additional stockings. There were also sheets, canvas beds, bolsters, and rugs. So it's amazing, I think, that we have records that show exactly what was each one of these women was given when they came across the ocean. As soon as they stepped off the boat, most of these women were married. The going price was 150 pounds of tobacco for each woman. In the 1622 passenger list, more than half of the 103 passengers came with families and their servants. So it's something else that's new. We didn't really know that. William Rousley, who came with his wife and their servant, 13 servants, had received his patent for a plantation less than a month before his departure from London. Edward Grindon and Isaac Chaplin were both returning planters. They had gone back to England and were now returning to Virginia. Grindon was returning with his wife, 2 children, and 6 servants. Chaplin was returning with a kinsman and 3 servants. William Craddock, who was to settle on the eastern shore, had with him his wife, Frances Craddock, and 5 servants. And John Cornish, another eastern shore settler, brought 3 servants. 1 passenger, Mary White, was traveling alone. She was coming, she thought, to join her husband, the Reverend Thomas White, who, unknown to her, had already died. A shipboard acquaintance consoled the widow, and by 1625, she had become the wife of Isaac Chaplin. At least 33 of the passengers appear to have been accompanied by kinfolk. Clearly, those who came to Virginia on the James in 1622 were not merely a cargo of young male indentured servants. Well over half of the servants, that is 47 out of 89, were traveling with their masters. 1/3 of the passengers had already been formed into family households. Another important piece of information. In 1623, the first census of Virginia was taken and listed the 73 settlers on the Eastern Shore. In the following year, another census was taken, listing 51 inhabitants, including 42 men, 7 women, and 2 children. And I can provide all of you with these lists if you want them separately. I can send them to Donna and she can get them to you. Again, this record provides the name and age of each person, as well as the ship on which they had sailed to Virginia and the date of their arrival in Virginia. So again, quite a bit of information. Among the surnames of the Eastern Shore at this time, the ones who were in those records were Rogers, Knight, Wilson, Parsons, Hall, Scott, Williams, Edmonds, Evans, Powell, Parks, Watkins, Davis, Wilkins, Smith, Barrett, Savage, Fisher, Piper, Paramore, Gascony, and Andrews. So those are the first settlers listed in those 2 records. Of all those settlers, the name of Thomas Savage stands out as the first permanent white settler on the Eastern Shore of Virginia. The literacy of these immigrants was probably more like New England than has been generally recognized. Numerous books came with the immigrants, including 216 different books ranging from medical books, books on agriculture, books on trades, and religious tracts. In 1622 alone, 500 books on the silkworm industry were sent to Virginia immigrants. And at that time, there were only 900 settlers in Virginia. So that meant one for about every 2 people, which is, I think, again, pretty amazing, showing their literacy. These records contradict the stereotypical view of Virginia colonists. These immigrants were neither as inadequate, indolent, or poverty-stricken as they have been portrayed. They came from almost every county in England, and a significant proportion of them crossed the Atlantic as a part of an established kinship group or network or household. Many were literate. So the settlers to Virginia no longer looked so different from those of Massachusetts Bay in New England. Now that we've looked at who these early settlers were, let's look at their social, economic, and religious conditions once they arrived in Virginia. Historian James R. Perry examined the formation of society on the Eastern Shore of Virginia from 1615 to 1655. Using the original records of the Eastern Shore, the oldest continuous records in British-speaking America, and those were the sources for his study. Perry focused on individuals, their social and economic interactions with other individuals, and the patterns which formed as a result of such contacts. This network analysis, as he called it, has opened up an entirely new dimension for the study of early Virginia history, using judicial, land, and probate records. The early Eastern Shore plantations were so isolated and remote from the other settlements of Virginia that the King of England for many years called this area Ye Kingdom of Accomac. Eastern Shore historian Jennings Cropper Wise reported that the settlement of the Eastern Shore began in 1610, when a canoe of settlers landed on the Eastern Shore and intermarried with the Naswadox Indians. In 1614, the first recognized settlement of the Eastern Shore took place when John Poree, the secretary of the colony of Virginia, sent 20 men to settle the area in order to boil water and make salt and to catch fish for the people of Jamestown. So that was what the first settlement on the Eastern Shores, the purpose of it was. This settlement was at what was called Dale's Gift, named in honor of the governor, Sir Thomas Dale. In 1617, John Rolfe, a tobacco planter who had married Pocahontas, reported that the Eastern Shore was one of 6 settlements in all of Virginia. It had 17 individuals, he said, all of whom were fed and maintained by the colony of Virginia in order or in return for their making salt and catching fish for the Western Shore Virginians. In 1618, the Virginia Company realized that to save the Virginia venture from financial collapse, a drastic change in corporate policy was necessary. The company established a new land policy, the headright system, which provided that an individual could acquire land in exchange for transporting individuals into Virginia. In 1620, and we'll come back to the headright system in a bit, so don't worry about that. In 1620, John Poree laid out a 500-acre tract at Kings Creek called the Plantation at Accomac and sent over 20 more tenants. Dale's Gift, on account of being the older settlement of the two, was from that time referred to as Old Plantation. But settlement on the Eastern Shore was now secure. From the first settlement, relations with the many tribes of the Eastern Shore was positive. In 1608, Thomas Savage had come to Virginia and was given to Powhatan by Captain Newport in exchange for an Indian. Savage lived with the natives for several years, learned their language, and became an interpreter. The native chief, Debbie Devan, or Esme Seekins, or the Laughing King as he's also called, gave Virginia's governor, George Yardley, all the land between Hunger's Creek and Cheriton Creek. And you can see that area outlined in red. That's the area which the Native American king gave to George Yardley. He also shared stores of corn with the new settlers, showing his friendliness. Before 1626, only 3 patents had been issued on the Eastern Shore. The first was to John Blower for 140 acres. Secondly, to Ensign Thomas Savage for what was called his dividend. And thirdly, to Sir George Yardley for 3,700 acres. From 1626 on, land patents began to be issued in large numbers. In 1631, a Virginia law was enacted which limited interactions between Indians and European settlers, although Accomac was exempted from those regulations because the natives and the Europeans got along so well on the Eastern Shore. In 1632, the court of Accomac began to meet regularly, led by a commission of 8 men, chosen each year from the local freemen who became the political and judicial leaders of the fledgling community on the Eastern Shore. The court records of Accomac begin at that time and are unbroken to the present time. It is from these records that we can build an account of the settlement and the growth of the Eastern Shore and its inhabitants. The judicial, land, and probate records are amazing in their detail. In 1642, the name of the peninsula was changed from Accomac to Northampton in honor of the home county in England of Obedience Robbins, who was a leading settler on the Eastern Shore at that time. He was also a Puritan. In 1663, the county was divided into 2 counties, Northampton in the south and Accomac in the north. In 1659, the Virginia legislature enacted a law against Quakers, causing large numbers of the Eastern Shore settlers who had Quaker sympathies to move north into Maryland, which had much more tolerant attitude toward religion. In 1665, Somerset County was officially created as a county, including all of the lower Eastern Shore of Maryland. You see between those 2 red lines. Soon, settlers were moving north into what became Somerset and as far north as into Sussex by 1680. Within 2 years, Sussex County would become one of the 3 lower counties of Pennsylvania, providing William Penn an outlet to the Atlantic Ocean and its trade. As more settlers came to the Eastern Shore, society began to develop. On February the 16th, 1623, a census of the living and dead on the Eastern Shore was compiled, showing that there were 73 settlers. In April of 1624, a disease called the foul distemper killed about 1/2 of all the persons in the colony. Also in 1624, a second census was taken of the Eastern Shore over the bay, showing that there were only 51 settlers alive at that time. By 1634, however, the Eastern Shore population had risen to 396 white inhabitants. Between 1634 and 1643, there was an increase of more than 600 inhabitants, making the total population of the Eastern Shore by that time around 1,000. Settlers began moving in earnest north in search of more land, thus beginning the process of northern migration into Accomac, then into Somerset County, and then into Sussex and Kent counties in Delaware. This movement northward and then again southward and again northward was to continue for hundreds of years on the Eastern Shore. By the 1630s, the socioeconomic development of the Eastern Shore was becoming crystallized. 4 distinct classes had been established. A substantial number of colonists were freemen who were already working for themselves. First, there were the so-called old planters, those who had come to Virginia prior to 1616 and who had paid their own way and had acquired hundreds of acres of land. As early as 1634 to 1637, many of the families who were to have great influence on the lower Eastern Shore for the next 200 years had already migrated into the peninsula. The local ruling class consisted of a small group of wealthy and politically powerful planters who employed a significant group of servants and freemen, as well as after 1661, a growing number of enslaved peoples. These planters, who had often come from the gentry or well-connected families in England, had acquired large fortunes during Virginia's early tobacco and land boom years. And they saw themselves as a class apart, as deserving of deference from the ordinary freedman as any manor lord or any squire in England would. The Scarboroughs, the Yardleys, the Andrews, Wises, Bowmans, and these are probably all, many of you are related to some of these folks, Eyre, the Corbins, the Upshers, the Wests, Littletons, Parkers, Croppers, Baileys, Joinses, Waters, Bagwells, Curtises, Augustuses, and Robbins family were among those people who comprised an isolated aristocracy in the early 17th century, which perpetuated itself for years with little appreciable admixture from outside blood. The second class consisted of carpenters, shipbuilders, and tradesmen, some of who had paid their own way to Virginia and received 50 acres and another 50 for each person for whom they had paid. Many of these men were now independent farmers and had developed family units. Third was a class of tenant farmers who rented their land or were hunters, fishermen, and oysterers. Others were simply laborers looking for a living. The fourth class consisted of white servants. The majority of these were indentured servants, people of lesser means who paid for their passage to the New World by selling their labor for a period of time after their arrival in the New World. The indentured servants were purchased for a period of 4 to 7 years, at the end of which they were free to make their own way in life. As they ended their indentures, many of these people moved into the second or third classes above them. Surprisingly, there was substantial mobility experienced by the freedmen coming to Virginia during the first 25 years of settlement. The colony was then thinly populated, land prices were low, and the right to patent 50 acres was part of the freedom dues of every servant. That person had only to pay the surveyors and clerks' fees to get a patent of land. Even so, only about 1/2 of the early freedmen actually became landowners, living on small tracts of land of from 50 to 400 acres. Perhaps 4 out of every 5 immigrants initially entered the colonies of Maryland and Virginia as a servant. By 1670, there was an increased demand for Irish indentured servants. Work on Chesapeake tobacco plantations was still done mainly by free farm laborers indentured for a period of years. Only as English servants became scarce did merchants turn to Scottish and Irish ports to recruit workers, and still later shift to unfree African labor. Male servants did outnumber females by a ratio of at least 3 to 1 for most of the 17th century. Thus, sexual imbalance and prevailing high rates of mortality among all immigrants held down natural population growth in the region for several generations. Only the continuous flow of immigrants from Britain, in large part the servants imported by the tobacco planters, kept the colonies afloat. In 1619, the economic and social diversity of the settlers was transformed when a Dutch ship brought 19 Africans to Virginia. They came as indentured servants, not slaves. Like the white indentured servants, the Africans were assigned to work under contract ranging from 5 to 7 years. And like other indentured servants immigrating to the colony, they were given their freedom dues when their contracts expired. They were granted the same rights as the European immigrants, and when their time was up, they took their places as farmers, craftsmen, and merchants alongside the rest of the community. The Eastern Shore family of John, Mary, and Anthony Johnson provides ample evidence for the way in which Blacks melded into the larger Eastern Shore community during the first 50 years of settlement of the Eastern Shore. Establishing a permanent colony was not easy in Virginia. By the end of the first year in Virginia, 2/3 of the original settlers had died. By 1610, more than 80% of the remaining immigrants died within 6 months. Of the nearly 500 inhabitants who were in Jamestown in 1610, only 60 survived the winter and the starving time, sometimes, as you know, resorting to cannibalism. In spite of these hazards, immigrants continued to come to America. The immigrant population was characterized by extreme morbidity, that is, they had a considerable number of diseases from which they were suffering until they seasoned, a high mortality rate, and a sexual ratio heavily weighted with male immigrants. These factors combined to restrict family formation and disrupt those families that did form. Very few families continued intact. Very few children had the same parents by the time they themselves were adults, because one or both the parents had died. The result was a society that was disproportionately youthful, single, and male. Yet there was a proliferation of kin ties, as mortality and remarriage led to subsequent linking of previously unrelated individuals. The strength of kin and neighborhood support networks and the stabilizing influence of local religious and governmental institutions all helped. Women who survived often married as often as 4 times, often becoming wealthy landowners themselves. And women on the Eastern Shore seem to have had a lot more power than judicial power, legal power, than women on the Western Shore of Virginia did. Land became available for the migrants in a way that they had never known in England. The period from 1635 to 1655 was a period of exceptional mobility, and I underscore that, exceptional mobility. An indentured servant could become a plantation owner and even become a county commissioner, the highest political office in a Virginia county. That happened to my immigrant ancestor who was on the Eastern Shore of Virginia at that time. By 1643, the area from Hunger's Creek to Kings Creek on the bay side had become so densely inhabited that settlers migrated north into Accomack to acquire individual land holdings there. At this time, there were no towns or even villages on the Eastern Shore. Only a few houses clustered around a public wharf on each navigable creek comprised the centers of trade for the planters who lived on their rural plantations, ruling their tenants and conducting their own affairs as the English gentry did. Tobacco and corn were their main crops, and tobacco and beaver skins were the currency which corresponded to silver and gold today. Only rarely was sterling money used to transact business. To encourage settlement in the new provinces, land grants were given to persons entering Virginia and Maryland to settle or for transporting others into the colony by a process called the head right, which we have mentioned before. The head right was instituted in 1618 in Virginia. When a person paid for his own transportation or the transportation of others who were settling in the colony, he would be entitled to 50 acres of land for each person that he paid the cost of transportation to America for. A person who paid for his own way and the transportation of his wife and children and of any servants and laborers would receive 50 acres for each one of those individuals. So it could be a substantial amount of land that a person would get. In Maryland, each tract of land was given a name, although the same is not true in Virginia or Delaware. It's very fortunate that we have that here on the eastern shore of Maryland, because it really helps in understanding the transition, the change of land from one owner to another. Indentured servants had no right to land after their indenture was over unless they purchased it. Land was taken up by a process involving 4 steps. Until 1680, the accumulation of land began with the application for a warrant. A warrant is a document which authorizes a survey of a tract of land. It authorizes the county surveyor to lay out so many acres of land and create a document called a certificate of survey. The certificate of survey is then done with a sketch of the boundaries, the tract of land with the total acreage identified. Finally, a patent is issued. The patent is a final official deed from the land office of the province conveying title and rights to a private owner. The patent is much like a deed in that it describes the property and indicates the conditions of tenure of the land. The patent records of Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware are all extant. And what you see on the screen there is a transcript of a patent for 600 acres of a property called Canardy at a rent of 12 shillings a year. I won't read the whole thing, but toward the bottom of it, it says, being on the seaboard side of Bogota Norton, on the westernmost side of Mojack Bay. So it describes in great detail where this piece of property is located and identifies it for all people to see. There were other land types, land record types as well. Once the patent had been issued, all other land transactions were called deeds or indentures. And the word deed and indenture, they're interchangeable. The deed is a conveyance of land from one individual to another and is kept in the county at the county level, not at the provincial level. Among the other land records, which would be helpful for family historians, are rent rolls and debt books. For Maryland, the rent rolls relate to the fact that the Calvert family really owned the land and that the owner of the land held it for use, owner in quotations of land, really held it for use from the Calverts. So an annual tax had to be paid to the Calverts for the use of the land, even though it was perpetual land holding. The rent rolls list the name of the patent, any owners of the patent, past or present, dates of sale of the property or sales of property if there's more than one, and transfer of the property from one generation to the next. So the rent rolls are very important in that respect. They can give you information that's nowhere else found. Debt books were equally important. They were kept between 1733 and 1774 in Somerset and Worcester County, and they indicate taxation levied upon the property user. So they're much like the rent rolls, just a separate record. The debt books really confirmed ownership of the property. For Virginia, a quit rent roll book exists for 1704, and I'm not aware, Donna, if there are other rent roll books for Virginia for the early period or not. Since much of Delaware was claimed by Maryland, similar land transactions occurred there. The Duke of York records dating from 1646 to 1679 provide an annual listing of the properties of this area. The Duke of York was the brother of the English king, and he, for a period of time, controlled much of the upper coast of seacoast of America. When the border between the eastern shore of Maryland and the eastern shore of Virginia was finalized in 1668, 25,400 acres were added to Maryland's territory from Virginia. Each of the old Virginia patents was re-registered in Maryland's land office. Northampton, Accomack, Somerset, Worcester, Dorchester, and Sussex all have their land records intact from the beginning. From, in Northampton's case, 1632, Accomack, 1663, Somerset, 1665, Worcester, 1742, because it was carved out of Somerset, and Dorchester, 1668, Sussex, 1680. So again, we're fortunate that there haven't been fires or natural disasters that have destroyed those records. In 1664, the tithable records begin on the eastern shore, and we see that about 1/2 of all property owners lived in units that included 5 or more tithables. Now, a tithable included all men over the age of 16 or sometimes 18, but usually 16. It included slaves, male and female, and any woman who was the head of household, but only if she was the head of household. That would mean she wouldn't have any son of age. So we can see from these records when young men do become of age, become independent and landholders on their own. Northampton, tithables exist from 1664 to 1720. Accomack's tithables from 1665 to 1695. And Somerset's 1678, 1681, and 1721 through 1757. And remember that for Worcester County, all those records from 1678 to 1742 that are in Somerset County are Worcester's as well. That's an important point to remember. Religiously, from early on, there were many denominations which peopled the shore. The Anglican Church was the state church of Virginia by 1619, and it was the state church of Maryland by 1692. From that time on until 1776, all people, whether they were Anglican or other beliefs, were taxed annually for the maintenance of the Anglican Church. Puritans had already made their way to Virginia by 1619, many becoming political and social leaders on the shore. Again, that's something that's kind of a surprise to a lot of folks. Dissenters, mainly Presbyterians, were tolerated in Maryland, unlike in Virginia, in which a policy of active persecution of the dissenting congregations took place. By the 1630s, a thriving trade with New England brought more Puritan beliefs into the Chesapeake. So that trade is very important for this flow of religious ideas. Presbyterian Scotsmen from Ulster in Northern Ireland came to the Eastern Shore as early as 1649, with that immigration really accelerating about 1670. In 1670, David Brown, who was a merchant with Glasgow connections, was established on the Minokan River in Somerset County. His brother-in-law, Archibald Erskine, was a merchant from Snow Hill on the Pocomoke. Brown might have been the catalyst for the immigration from Ulster of Presbyterians during the next years. In 1680, the Presbytery of Lagan in Donegal County in Ireland received an appeal from Colonel William Stevens for a minister to serve the Presbyterian communities on the Eastern Shore. Stevens himself was an Englishman from Buckinghamshire, and he was an Anglican, but he was acting on behalf of many of his Presbyterian neighbors. That he appealed to the Lagan Presbytery in Ireland is an indication that these neighbors were themselves from the area of Lagan in Northern Ireland. Many Presbyterian families from County Donegal had already settled in Somerset County before 1680. Quakers began arriving in Somerset County as early as 1662. Persecuted in Virginia for slandering the clergy, defying the laws, uttering blasphemy, Quakers began to come in large numbers to the Eastern Shore of Maryland, where they could establish themselves without much interference and where there was considerably more freedom and freedom of thought and conscience. The Quaker refugees from Accomack congregated at the Little and Big Anamessock tributaries and on the eastern in Somerset County, going as far up as the Minokan River. So that's where they're first settling. Church records are less well preserved than other types of colonial records. For Hunger's Parish Church, that's in Northampton County, there are only 4 pages of births, marriages, and deaths that survive. And those are from 1660 to 1662, a very important time, but only 4 pages. And they were found not in a vestry record, but in a court, sandwiched in with the court records. Not until the 18th century do we begin to find intact vestry records for the churches of the Eastern Shore of Virginia. Hunger's Parish court records we've mentioned. St. George's and Accomack parishes in Accomack County survived beginning in 1757. So from that time on, there will be church records available for Northampton and for Accomack for the Anglican congregations. For Somerset County, Maryland, Anglican records survive for Coventry Parish from 1736 to 1828. Somerset Parish, 1685 to 1897. Stepney Parish in northern Somerset County has records dating from 1703 to 1890. Once Worcester County was separated from Somerset in 1742, her church records began to include St. Martin's parish records dating from 1722. There are a few assorted records from Snow Hill Parish beginning in 1828. Their records burned prior to that. In Sussex County, Delaware, church records exist for St. George's Chapel. That was a chapel of ease of St. Martin's Chapel in Worcester County from 1755. Those records exist. For Dorchester County, the Episcopal records of both parishes, Dorchester Parish and Great Choptank Parish, exist from 1743. For dissenting congregations, there were also numerous surviving records. Snow Hill dissenting congregations records begin in 1750. Buckingham Presbyterian Church records begin in 1790, and I've transcribed those. Georgetown, Delaware Presbyterian Church records extend from 1857 to 1913. Lewis, Delaware Presbyterian Church records exist from 1737 to 1856. Now remember, all these people are in Worcester County, so you need to look in Worcester County and in Sussex County for them in the church records as well as land records and probates. And finally, Blackwater Presbyterian Church near Frankfort in Sussex County, Delaware, has records from 1778 to 1828. By 1653, Northampton County had 500 white tithables, including only males over age 18. At that time, the 18 was the age of realization, and perhaps as many as 2,000 residents in the county. By 1663, Accomack and Northampton were divided into two counties because of their large populations. By 1657, Lord Baltimore was offering inducements to draw people to Maryland. Fabulous tales were spread about the great wealth of Maryland. There was a land boom going on in Maryland. Tobacco had become the staple crop. Much shipbuilding was going on. A profitable trade in fur with the natives was taking place. The population was rising rapidly under the favorable settlement terms which Lord Baltimore extended to patentees of land. Eastern Shore Virginians continued to move northward into Maryland in search of land and trade items. Yet, we know for certain that there were individuals resident on the lower eastern shore of Maryland long before 1657. There were traders and trappers who had already staked the area out. For example, John Westlock of Northampton County had already been there in Somerset since at least 1640, a long time before the county was created. In March of 1660, the General Assembly of Virginia passed a law against Quakers as people who were teaching lies, miracles, false visions, prophecies, and doctrines tending to disturb the peace, to disorganize society and destroy all law and government and religion. Lord Baltimore immediately accepted the petition of the Virginia Quakers to enter into Maryland's lower eastern shore, and by 1662, many of them were already well settled in Maryland. The first Quaker settlements were on the south bank of the great Anamessex River. Not far away, another settlement, made up primarily of Church of England folks, was located along the Minokan River. It was then that the border between Maryland and Virginia became a matter of dispute. At this time, a boundary dispute intensified between Maryland and Virginia, partially as a result of large land holdings of more than 25,000 acres held by Edmund Scarborough in both Maryland and Virginia. Edmund Scarborough, Randall Revel, and John Elsie, all from Northampton County, became the first commissioners of the new county of Somerset. Although Scarborough remained a citizen of Virginia, Revel and Elsie settled in Maryland and became leaders of the fledgling settlement there. Although we do not know the exact date of the planting of the settlements in Maryland, it is certain that by the spring of 1662, they were well planted and healthily growing by the Anamessex and Minokan rivers. By May 1662, Revel reported that there were 50 tithable persons seated at Menai and Anamessex, a place distant some 4 miles from Minokan. So that's May of 1662. An agreement was made with the Emperor of the Nanticoke Indians in regard to the areas of settlement. The Virginia settlers came first to the great Anamessex River, as we've said, and among those settlers were Stephen Horsey, again from Northampton, Ambrose Dixon, Thomas Price, George Johnson, and Henry Bosson. Those are the people who settled on the Anamessex at first. On the Minokan were the Revel, Elsie, and Thorne families, soon followed by the Polk family. On Menai Creek was the Quaker Covington family. In 1672, another large Virginia contingent came to settle on the seaside of Maryland's eastern shore. Immigrants in this wave were the Bishops, Bowens, Brittinghams, Hudsons, Ennises, Ratcliffes, and Edward Smith families, followed soon by the Purnell, Robbins, Selby, Spence, Townsend, Oughton, and Whaley families. These families were to dominate what would later become Worcester County. 40 years after the first settlers began to arrive on the eastern shore of Maryland, laws were passed transforming the conditions of many Africans living in Virginia and Maryland. In 1661, Virginia's legislature had passed its first law allowing any free person to have the right to own slaves. That was in 1661 in Virginia. Soon after, the Virginia legislature passed laws regulating slavery in that province. Soon after that happened, the colony of Maryland did the same thing by establishing the institution of slavery. In 1664, Maryland's legislature passed a law providing for all Negroes or other slaves, whether already in the province or transported after that time, that is 1664, were to serve, quote, during their lives, end quote. A later law in 1671 reflected an ambivalent attitude toward Negro servitude, suggesting that blacks who were Christians possessed souls and therefore merited salvation. By the end of the 17th century, slavery was becoming an important part of the economic way of life of both Virginia and Maryland. The legislatures of both provinces continued to enact legislation further limiting freedom for African Americans. Slavery was on its way to becoming a perpetual institution for many Africans. Looking back at the path of European immigration to the Eastern Shore, the period from 1607 to 1670 saw a time in which pioneer immigrants settled first at Jamestown, then moved across the bay to the lower eastern shore of Virginia, gradually moving northward into Accomack, and finally, as you can see on the right-hand map, settling in what became Old Somerset County, Maryland. And from there, they moved on up north into Sussex and Kent counties in Delaware, which were at the time the three lower counties, two of the three lower counties of Pennsylvania. During the first century of settlement, land was taken up with an amazing rapidity. A microcosm of this rapid development may be seen in the mapping of land patents done by local historians Michael Hitch and John Lyon, who have platted every patent on the lower eastern shore of Maryland and lower Delaware as well. Using the area which was to become Worcester County as our sample, this is what we see. So if you'll look with me, we'll start in 1670. You'll see that there were relatively few patents in what was the seaside area of Worcester County. Everything is along the sea or along the Pocomoke River. By 1680, now watch as this changes. By 1680, we see additional lands being occupied. By 1690, even more land is being taken up. By 1700, still more lands are being taken up, while the decades between 1710, 1720, 1730, 40, 50, 60, 70, and finally 80. Look at that. Hardly anything left that hasn't been patented. So we see an amazing transformation of the Eastern Shore lands by immigrants and their children and grandchildren. Within 20 years of the first settlement of Virginia, Eastern Shore settlers had moved north in search of more land and profitable fur trapping sites. This was a move which continued decade by decade until the Eastern Shore settlers had moved north from Northampton County into Accomack, into Old Somerset, and eventually they began to migrate out of Delmarva to the Carolinas and into Georgia and into Kentucky, until there are few areas in the United States which cannot lay claim to having an Eastern Shore ancestry, even Alaska. On account of the vast number of migrations which have spread out from its core, Delmarva deserves to be called the seedbed of America, with descendants of those original migrants having spread to all 50 of the states. Okay, are there any questions?
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. You got some comments saying it was worth the wait. So thanks for sticking with us.
Oh, I am so sorry that happened. That was really embarrassing.
I apologize too. I should have asked to meet earlier, but it's all good now. We're all good.
You know, I am not a tech person. I thought, well, I'll get on early, and I thought, no, I can't come on early because there won't be anybody there to let me in.
Well, yeah. It's all right. It all worked out. Okay. We had lots of people commenting when they saw their ancestors on the screen. Somebody said, there is John and Bridget Wilkins, my people.
Oh, good.
John Paramore was my ancestor. We got a comment that there's a lineage society for this area, Delmarva First Families. It's a reincarnation of the original first families of Delmarva. Delmarva information may be obtained from Delmarva_first_families at AOL.com.
Yeah.
Ray, your slides are terrific. Hello from Wilmington, Delaware.
Well-
A couple questions about smallpox. I think it was a point where you were talking about lots of people dying, and somebody
Yes.
asked, was it smallpox? And then somebody said smallpox was a known disease then, so probably not.
There was smallpox, but what killed them were other kinds of diseases.
Yeah.
And that's a whole nother lecture.
I can imagine. Our talk next month is not with you, but with somebody exploring the medical practices in the 18th and 19th century. So
wonderful.
so we will learn somewhat, but maybe not about all of what the diseases you're talking about. But, let's see. John Custis too enslaved my ancestor. Ray, I believe you were with my cousins, Laura and Buddy Jenkins, at St. Martin's over the weekend, if I'm not mistaken.
I was. Just yesterday, as a matter of fact. Yes. Yep.
Were Catholics on the eastern shore of Maryland?
Well, that's an interesting thing. There is a record which was published in the Gentleman's Magazine in England in 1755 that said, that went through all the counties, and they indicated that Worcester County had one Catholic, Somerset County had no Catholics in 1755.
Wow.
So this was a very heavily Protestant area. The area of Catholic Eastern Shore is much to the north in an area of Cordova, above Talbot County, above Queen Anne's County.
Okay. At the time of Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, Native American enslaved people were the majority of slaves on the big tobacco plantations in Virginia. Was this the case in Maryland?
1676. It was not the case. It was becoming the case, but still I think I said in the lecture, by the 1670s, still free labor was white labor, servitude, from England and then later from Scotland and Northern Ireland, was the main workforce, and that is proven by the records. By around 1687 to 1690, that's changing. We begin to see more enslaved people in the records, but we see just as many indentured people with X number of years yet to serve in the inventories and in the probate records.
Okay. Lots of thank yous and fascinatings. Enjoyed it. Thank you. Amazing history lesson. I had not fully appreciated the importance of this small section of early America.
Yeah,
wonderful maps. You're getting lots of compliments on the maps.
Oh, good. Well, I think maps are just so important.
Yes.
And as I said to Donna early on, when we were talking about this, people don't really understand that people are not moving. Boundaries are moving. The boundaries of the provinces or of the counties are moving. So if you're doing research on the Eastern Shore, you really need to look in to see what county your person, he may have been in the same county, but what the boundary lines were drawn as at any given time. Does that make sense?
Indeed.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of time, many of us have stories of ancestors that we can find in one location in one year, one location in another year, another location in another year, and they never moved.
Absolutely. Yeah.
When indentures ended on the Virginia Eastern Shore in the 1660 to 1675 period, what were the considerations for settling in Maryland versus Virginia?
Well, it was a matter of toleration. Maryland was much more tolerant than Virginia was, so that's what kept people moving from Virginia into Maryland. Even in the 1670s, land was a big thrust, and of course that's why I kept showing you that northward movement from finally up into Sussex into Kent County, because it's wherever there is still good land along water, along creeks or along rivers, that's going to be taken up.
Indeed. How many of the marriages would have been arranged to increase land holdings?
Oh, I would say, oh, this is a guess. Nearly all of them. I always tell people there was no such thing as a love marriage in that period of time. People were married because of station, because of hope to get land, or something, some economic benefit. They were not, there wasn't because your heart went pity pat because you saw somebody.
Okay.
I can't think of a case where that happened. One of the youngest marriages on the Eastern Shore was a girl who was 12 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's just goodness.
And she died in childbirth at 14.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
What about the treaties to obtain ownership from natives?
Oh, okay.
They're keeping you on your toes tonight, aren't they?
I think that I have a whole series of lectures on that that I've done on the Eastern Shore. But remember, there are so many tribes. There were, I would guess, probably in the neighborhood of 18 tribes on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, and maybe 8 or 9 on the Lower Eastern Shore of Maryland during the 17th century. So I guess the questioner is asking about each one of those. What happened, unfortunately, was that reservations were made. You're aware of that, and it didn't take long for the reservations to be overtaken. People would just absorb more and more of the territory until the reservations were gone. There was one by Snow Hill, there was one by Cambridge, there was one near Vienna, there was one down not far from Princess Anne. Most of them didn't last any time at all. Askham and Constant at Princess Anne lasted the longest. There were treaties made between the colony, the colonial officials, and various Native American tribes. The Natticokes were usually considered to be hostile. The Pocomoks and those further south were considered more congenial, although certainly they began to oppose having their lands absorbed. But it wasn't long before their numbers were so small. The Native Americans today tell me that they are hidden in plain sight, and that probably is true, but we just have very few records to help us understand their plight. It's all from the colonist side, and from the provincial side.
Oh, okay. At what point were surgeons and medical doctors arriving?
Oh, well, I can say that with some certainty that they're there by at least on the Eastern Shore by at least 1634, 2 years after court records began. John Holloway was a chirurgeon, was a doctor, and following him, there are any number of doctors who are listed on the shore. I've transcribed the inventories of 17th century Somerset County, and one of the earliest records there is for a chirurgeon named Alexander Ennis, and it lists all of his medical tools. Some of the early accounts, and this is something that some of you might be I know I'm digressing, but some of you might be interested in, is the accounts of an estate in this early period often give almost day-by-day accounts of medical attention which was given by a doctor to a person, telling what the medicine was that was administered, how much of it, and I'm just amazed by as you can guess, amazed by the completeness of the records, the amount of information found in those early records. I know that goes beyond what you asked, but but it's exciting. Your
Yes.
next the person you have next month will be able to tell you a lot about that, because that is, I think, an increasingly important. People are realizing how important health issues were for their early settlers, particularly where they got their water.
Yeah. I think it's a later time frame, but it's still definitely different medical practices than we're accustomed to now. So it's important to understand.
Yeah, it really is very important to understand.
Okay. Who are some of the famous people who had Delmarva origins?
Well, Samuel Lecompte, the founder of Lecompton, Kansas, which was the slave capital of Kansas, was a fairly well-known individual. Of course, at the Alamo were Sam Houston and Davy Crockett. They had origins on the Eastern Shore. Let's think. Oh gosh. Sturgis, North Dakota, is named after an Eastern Shore person. If you're looking for people who are really well known, there were a lot of 17th, 18th, and early 19th century people here on the shore who are what you would call movers and shakers. I'm now transcribing letters of a lady named Elizabeth Teakle in cooperation with a descendant of hers. And Elizabeth Teakle was an upshur from Northampton County. Her husband, Littleton Dennis Teakle, of course, had roots in Northampton and Accomack, but they moved up to Somerset County, built Teakle Mansion, which is the most impressive house still standing in Somerset County, actually. He was, maybe I shouldn't say he's famous. Maybe I should say he's infamous. I'm not quite sure. He lost that grand house 3 times during his life, and through his wife's good graces, got it back again. So there are others that we could name. These people were not sticks in the mud. They were not in the outer areas. A lot of folks from Worcester County and Somerset, Accomack, and Northampton County bought the early lands of Washington, D.C., right around what would today be the White House, that area. I could name the people who owned those lands right where the Capitol and where the White House is. They're all Eastern Shore people.
Goodness. I'm confused about the location of Quantico in Somerset County, later cut into Wicomico. There seems to be a couple of places with that name. Do you have any information about that?
Yes, there's a Quantico on the Western Shore, isn't there? The Quantico here, I honestly don't know what the origin of the name is. It very possibly might be a Native American name, but as far as I know, there was never a tribe called Quantico, so I can't really answer it. Quantico is today just a very little sleepy village, one of the oldest in what is Wicomico now. It was Somerset at that time, but it's a small town. I don't know its origin. Sorry.
Have you published a history of the Eastern Shore?
No, I've done a lot of. I've transcribed dozens and dozens of ledgers and that sort of thing. But people have asked me to do it, but I guess my time is being spent helping other folks with their uncover their roots. So that probably is not going to happen unless we just put all the lectures I've done together into a book. That might happen, I suppose.
One of the comments is, I don't remember my high school Maryland history classes being this thorough. I grew up in an integrated community settled by Quakers, Protestants in 1726, and freed blacks.
Yeah. Well, talking about the freed blacks, by soon after the Revolution, freeing the enslaved was something that was happening at a rapid rate. The Methodist Church, which we didn't get a chance to talk about, but which was a newly formed congregation in America in 1778. The Methodist ministers were railing at their congregants, get rid of your slaves, end slavery, it's an immoral institution. So very often, if they didn't free them, if they didn't monument their slaves during their lives, very often in the wills they would free the slaves. So there was a very large population of free Black people living in communities throughout the lower eastern shore of Maryland by 1810.
To what degree are the records digitized? Is there an ongoing project?
There was an ongoing project. I can't tell you what's happening now. I'm retired and I'm not at the NAB Center any longer. But what we tried to do at the NAB Center when I was there was to do what we called one-stop shopping. We wanted to have every single record from the colonial area of Eastern Shore, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware at the center, so people could come there and do their research in one place. And we were pretty successful in getting records, either the originals, microfilms, transcripts, abstracts of those records. I'd say we have, I think, close to probably 98% of the records of Delmarva at the center. Right now, there are digitalization. There are volunteers who are working on transcribing ledgers. I've transcribed a number of physicians' ledgers from the 19th century here. Have done women's ledgers. Believe it or not, there were stores which kept separate ledgers for women, and I've transcribed about with another person about 8 or 9 of those. There are in ledgers which give amazing amounts of detail about people. I just can't emphasize enough how these various kinds of records help you understand your person. Where, as I've said to Donna before, when one door closes, another door opens, as far as records are concerned. You just have to be persistent in looking for the right kind of record. When I started doing, again, this is a digression, but maybe it'll be helpful to people. When I started doing research on my family, I had no idea that I had any ancestry here on the Eastern Shore at all. I grew up in Kansas, northwestern Kansas, on a farm, and came here in 1972 to teach. And in the process of my teaching, I recalled vaguely some names that my mother's mother had mentioned. And so I thought, I wonder if there's a connection here. And eventually I discovered that, yes, they had been here on the shore since 1635 down in Northampton County, and then in Worcester County, what became Worcester County. So I began looking at the records for the immigrant ancestor who was an indentured servant, came as an indentured servant at age 22 in 1635. And I was able to compile a book of 130 pages on his life. Now, he was not, he became a county commissioner just before his death in 1680s, but he started out as an indentured servant. And that led me to realize people were really very mobile during that short period of time, 1635 to 1650. You could make yourself what you wanted to. So I think what I've said about the literacy of these people, their longevity, those are things that are very important. They help us understand these people, and we can really put flesh on the bones. It's nice to know a person's name, but it's much nicer, I think, to be able to sort of wrap yourself in the fabric of what this person was like, and what he or she thought and how they lived. And that was what I did with that volume. So most of you could do the same thing with your family.
Indeed.
Pretty sure.
I've got a couple of neighboring locations questions. Does the NAB
Okay.
Center have records for the area that is now Washington, D.C. and surrounding Maryland?
We do not have records. Well, we have a few, but we do not have records for the Western Shore. We really tried initially when we were creating the center, since the majority of the holdings came from people who had goodwill about what we were doing and they would purchase materials for us. We cut the material at Talbot County because we thought it was as easy for people from Talbot to get to Annapolis, which is the state archives, as it was down to us. So anything below Talbot County, we collect, and anything below Kent, we collected, but above that, we didn't. Now, just before I retired, I got 15,000 volumes of original records or of transcripts of original records of New England records. So all the many of the early records of New England are there as well. All the original Dutch transcripts of Dutch records are there from the 1600s, the early 1600s. A pretty amazing collection, really.
Indeed. So the answer is probably the same to this one, but do you also lecture on the other areas of Maryland, or do you focus on the Eastern Shore?
You may not believe this, but my PhD is Greek and Roman history. So I spend as much time doing Greece and Rome as I do the area of the local history. But I do love local history. I created a master's degree in local history when I was the chair of the history department at SU, and co-created the research center for the NAB Center for Delmarva research and culture and history my heart's really here. It's because these records are so good. They are so thorough, and you might think, well, I can't find it. It's not in this record. Well, if it's not in this record, it may be in another record. That's why I mentioned to you all the 4 different steps in patenting. There is different information in the warrant, the certificate of survey, and the patent. So you need to look at all those records because they are each one going to have just a tiny bit of different information in that will maybe give you what you need. There are records called testamentary proceedings in Maryland, starting in, I think, 53. Those records are the only records that sometimes give the names of widows of a man who died. Because very often men just say to my wife in the will, they don't say who the wife is. But the testamentary proceedings will give that woman's name. And you know what? Very often she's remarried.
Yep. We got a kind of addendum to that. The Library of the Maryland Historical Society has an extensive genealogy index of most Maryland families as well. It's no longer called the Maryland Center of History and Culture, and it is on Monument Street in Baltimore. So if you're interested in that, you can scroll down in the chat box.
That's correct. That's correct. I
got a couple of votes for consolidating lectures and publishing them in an anthology.
Oh, well, that would I'm happy to work with anybody who's interested in Eastern Shore history, because it is if you once get into those records, you really do fall in love with them, I think.
Indeed. Was there much overlapping with the Eastern Shore and the Northern Neck area?
Oh yes, there was. Many of the people from the area of Wicomico itself, from Salisbury, their origins were down in the Northern Neck. The Nelms family, who were merchants here in the Revolutionary period, their antecedents were over in the Northern Neck, and at least 2 of John Nelms, the merchant here, 2 of his sons went back to the Northern Neck to live. So they had kept the land over on the Western Shore in the family, I guess, and decided to move back there. So yeah, there are connections. And those records of the Northern Neck are wonderful too.
Indeed. And the last question I'm going to ask is off topic. Is Claudia from Kansas?
No, she is a German immigrant. She grew up. She moved to the U.S. In the early 1950s, and she and her family. Her father was a doctor in Dodge City, Kansas. So she is a Dodge City girl.
Okay, and how can we contact you? Is that in one of the handouts? I didn't look at them that closely.
I don't believe it is, but Donna has the information, and my email is grthompson@salisbury.edu. I still use that. So I will not be available during the next week because I am actually heading back out to Kansas tomorrow morning, but I will answer emails as soon as I get back in a week or so, and I'm happy to help you on anything. If there's anything in the PowerPoint that you wanted to have copies of, like the names of the people from the 1623 census or the 1624-25 census, or the people whose lands were in Virginia but moved to Maryland in 1668, any of that sort of thing, or any variety of other kinds of things, I'm happy to provide information for you.
Okay. And I was going to wrap it up there, but Claudia Gibson in the chat box is saying that she went to high school with Claudia and wants to say hello.
Well, just a second. All right. Claudia Gibson is on for you.
Well, I didn't expect that. We were just passing on hello. But,
I don't know if she'll come up or not. Yep, go ahead.
Definitely would like the 1623 census info. So
Okay,
Abigail, I have posted the email address in the chat box so you can reach out to them.
Good. And there are, in addition to the records that Donna put online for all of you, there are what I call little used records that are just phenomenal too, that are one of a kind kinds of things. So, and I've made lists of those. I can pass those on to anybody who's interested in those as well. So I think the important thing is to get the material out so people can get infected with the love of family history.
Sounds fantastic. And oh, there's Claudia in the background. The Claudia saying hello said her maiden name was Eddington.
Eddington. Claudia Eddington is your.
I know Claudia Eddington.
She's online here.
Oh my goodness, Claudia Eddington.
I don't know if you can see her or not, because I don't believe she's.
Claudia, you can turn your mic on if you would like.
Let me see. I don't see any pictures.
Yeah.
Oh.
Here, I'll get you.
Oh well.
Yeah.
She can't find it, but she's saying hello. So.
Hello. Claudia, you bought the flower shop, didn't you, in Dodge?
Okay, I'm here. No,
there you go.
My mother had the flower shop, and hi, Claudia. I last saw you at our class reunion.
Yep.
Good to see you.
And my sister probably keeps in contact with you. And
I'm in contact with Michie, and good to see you. What a surprise.
Oh my gosh.
This was quite a surprise.
The internet.
Yep.
All right, we'll be in touch. I hope to see you one of these days. All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
What a small world. And with that, I will thank you to Ray for such a fabulous presentation. Thank you to everyone for your patience and hanging with us and attending.
I'm sorry about that.
No, it's all good. It was well worth the wait. So thank you, everyone. And thank you. And we will see everybody next month.
Okay. Goodbye.
Does it work better in here? Why did you bring my computer in here?
Had to.